Welcome, everyone. I am joined today by Dr. Amrita Myers, who is an associate professor of history and gender studies at Indiana University. Her focus is mostly on Black women's history in the slave South, and she comes to us today specifically because she is putting the finishing touches on her second book, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. So welcome, Professor Myers. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. It's really my pleasure to be here with you.
All right. So I guess for starters, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved with Julia Chinn's story?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a specialist in African American women's history, specifically Black women's history in the Old South. And my first book, Forging Freedom, looked specifically at the lives of three Black women in Charleston, South Carolina, from 1790 to 1860. So when I was doing research for that book, I actually spent quite a bit of time looking at the lives of enslaved and free Black women in the Old South, looking at Charleston, South Carolina in particular. And I did quite a bit of research looking at interracial families and interracial couples in that city in particular. And I had always hoped that I would be able to do a longer project on one family or one woman and her descendants, because the latter half of that book looks specifically at certain families over the course of 2 or 3 generations and what the power dynamics were like in those families and in those relationships, what women were able to accomplish in those particular relationships, what kind of power they had, where the lines were drawn in terms of, their privileges, what they could do, what they couldn't do, how white and Black people in the city reacted to these relationships, how the children of these relationships and families were treated, these sorts of things. And I thought to myself, it would be wonderful if I was able to do a longer study. But I didn't really think I would ever really be able to do such a thing because archival resources and materials are so fragmentary. It's so difficult to be able to find enough source material. It was excruciatingly difficult for me to be able to even do a chapter on a relationship such as this. The thought of being able to do an entire book, I just didn't think it would be possible. When I was actually wrapping up research on Forging Freedom, I came across a mention in a textbook, a US survey textbook, on Richard Mentor Johnson, who was 9th Vice President of the United States. And it was literally almost like a footnote or an afterthought, and it was really a not very polite mention. It was, I regularly teach the first part of the survey to freshmen here at Indiana University. It's, the 500 years and 15 weeks from the era of contact all the way to the end of the Civil War in one semester. And as I was preparing to get ready to teach the course, many years ago now, I came across this mention of Richard Johnson, and it was this almost like a throwaway sort of little mention about Johnson and his many concubines. And it was really about how abolitionists were taught, it was a 19th century chapter talking about the abolitionist movement and how Northerners and abolitionists used Johnson as an example of how Southern politicians were abusing slave women. And this was a reason to abolish slavery. And I thought to myself, who is Richard Mentor Johnson and why have I never heard of him? I'm a 19th century historian. I've done so much work on the South and on enslaved women. I'm finishing a book about to come out with UNC Press. This was, 2010, 2011. How have I never heard of Richard Mentor Johnson and his many concubines and mistresses? And so I sort of thought, well, let me bookmark this and I'll come back to it later because I was really busy at the time. And about a year later, I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues, Christina Snyder, who went on to publish a book on Choctaw Academy, a Native American boarding school for young men, for young men, mainly from the Choctaw Nation, but some of them also came from other Native American nations. And as in our conversation, she mentioned that Choctaw Academy was on the premises of a plantation in Kentucky owned by none other than Richard Mentor Johnson. And I said, stop. Is this the same Johnson, vice president, who had these supposedly had all of these relationships with numerous Black women? And she said, yes. But it's a little more complicated than that, And I said, well, wasn't one of these women, Julia Chinn? I read something about it in a survey textbook, and she said, yes, he was with Chinn for almost a quarter century, and they had 2 daughters together. And that's really how I sort of, I sort of call myself an accidental biographer in some ways. I mean, I'm a historical private detective, really, in many regards, but it's really been a long path to this book, Andrew, because my interest in Black women has always been there. That's what I've been doing for the better part of 2 decades. And I've long been interested in power and interracial relationships and privilege and how Black women negotiate power and privilege for themselves and their children, through these very, very complicated relationships. And that comes out in my first book. But I never thought I would be able to do a long-standing study like this on a family like Johnson and Chinn's. But that first mention in the textbook and then the larger conversation with Christina Snyder ultimately led me to this place, because I started looking up Julia Chinn and Richard Johnson on the internet, and really was off and running after that, because there was just so little that had been done, very little scholarly work. It was mostly sort of trashy websites and voyeuristic mentions of Johnson and his many concubines, and the same sort of kind of voyeuristic, not very scholarly discussions of Julia Chinn. And I kept thinking to myself, someone really needs to write a historical, archivally sourced, grounded book on Julia Chinn. And Dr. Snyder said to me, isn't that kind of what you do? She said to me all those years ago. And I thought to myself, gosh, that is really what I do. And here we are a decade later. So a long answer to your short question, but this is how it began all those years ago.
That's awesome. The sort of on a, it's funny that you say, that sort of this chain of events that leads you to learn more about Chinn and Johnson. I remember coming across, it was when I was reading one of Lincoln's Douglas debates, and there's like a one-off line where he says, the only man I ever met, he's like defending himself from an accusation that he wants to marry Black women, basically. And he says, the only man I ever met who was in favor of true equality was Colonel Johnson. And that line is like met with laughter from the crowd, and sort of being like, well, who is this guy that apparently everyone knows because they laugh. But so it's interesting, the chains that lead us to places. So I guess sort of to delve into Julia and Richard, I guess the main question here is, what can we know and what can't we know about their relationship with each other?
I think that's a very important people. One of the things that I refuse to do is engage in discussions about feelings, right? There are a lot of people who want to cast this as a love story. And I absolutely won't do that, because we don't have any documentation in Julia or her daughter's hands. Not because they weren't literate, because they were. All 3 of the women, Adeline, Imogene, and Julia, knew how to read and write. And we know this because other people, including Richard himself, refer to their letters in their own. So when Richard is writing to other men, he talks about Julia's letters, he talks about Adeline's letters, but none of those letters have survived to this day. We suspect, I actually am almost positive that they were deliberately destroyed by Richard's own family, white family members, his brothers. And we can talk more about that, certainly. But I think that they did that because they were ashamed and embarrassed of their brother's lifestyle choices. And so they, destroyed those letters to try and erase Julia and her daughter's existence from the face of the earth. But that being said, because we don't have records that were written by Julia or Imogene or Adeline, we don't know how they felt. Right? We don't know how Julia felt about Richard. So I can't say that she loved him. And also the power dynamics of slavery make that a very, very complicated and difficult dynamic, right? There's coercion. We can't, choice, words like choice become extremely complicated. Richard never freed Julia, and under the laws of Kentucky, he could have done so. There's nothing that stopped him from actually freeing her legally, but he never did. And that was one of the things that he always held over her, right? In the sense that he gave her all kinds of privilege. He gave her all kinds of power. She ran the plantation in his absence when he lived in Washington for 6 months every year because he was a career politician for 40 years. He was a congressman, a senator, and eventually vice president of the United States. She was known as the mistress of the manor, right? Like she was his wife. He never married a white woman. She functioned as his wife for all intents and purposes. She carried the keys to the plantation. She had access to the money, the lines of credit. She oversaw the slave laborers on the plantation. Vendors and merchants in the area did business with her. She signed contracts. But so even though she had all this power and all this privilege, he never set her free, right? The daughters were educated when they came of age. He arranged very good marriages for them with local white men in the community. He gave the daughters land. He gave them enslaved laborers. He gave them cash. They were treated with all the respect that was due legitimate daughters, and he treated them as such. And in fact, eventually his daughters crossed the color line and they lived as white women. They were recorded in the census books as white women, and their children were recorded as white people on the books. But at the end of the day, Julia was never set free, and she died as an enslaved person. And so I simply cannot look at and treat this as some sort of Harlequin romance, and I won't do that. Does he treat her with respect? I have to look at the materials that I have. I have to look at the sources, and I have to analyze behavior and action. So what do we know? We have to go by what we have in terms of the documentation, what other people say about them, and what the records allow us to analyze. But I'm not going to go beyond that and speculate about how she may have felt about him, because that would be me taking a step over the line into the realm of fantasy, and I'm a historian, and I simply choose not to do that.
It's in a way exactly what is separating you from all of the, as you said before, sort of the voyeuristic and sort of salacious accounts that that you came across when you were first looking her up. That's sort of the bridge too far here. This is the actual history. It's what we know.
Well, I have to be mindful. I'm a Black woman's historian, and this is a power dynamic between slave master and enslaved woman, a white man and a Black woman in the slave South. Richard Johnson, at the end of the day, was a slaveholder, and Julia was not the only slave that he owned. And they might have had a different relationship in many respects, but at the end of the day, this is something that I cannot and I won't forget as I have to keep front and center as I write the story.
Thank you. And so you actually partially answered this in your previous answer, but I just was hoping you could elaborate on it a little bit further. Um, terminology, of course, is incredibly important. We here at our site, and of course many places elsewhere, have really been sort of zoning in on that. And over the last few years, of course, the obvious one is the shift from slave to enslaved and things of that nature. And so, of course, in this story, terminology is also important. And you've made a very conscious decision to go with the term wife when discussing Julia. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you came to that decision?
I'm really glad that you asked me that question. I thought about it long and hard, actually. And, you know, I definitely, I mean, I use enslaved and slave back and forth in the text first, partly for purposes of flow of prose. I try to use enslaved as much as possible, certainly, but there are some places where slave just works better for the writing. But in terms of the word wife, I think it's really important to understand that Richard, first of all, referred to Julia as his wife. And so that to me is very significant. Second of all, Richard never married anyone else. He didn't have a white wife. He did not, the only family that he had was with Julia and their daughters, Imogene and Adeline. He didn't hide Julia in the slave quarters. He lived openly with her and their daughters. Everyone knew about the relationship. When you referred to Abraham Lincoln making the reference to Colonel Johnson and everyone laughing, that was because everyone knew about the relationship. It was not a secret. Everyone locally and nationally knew about Colonel Johnson's Black family, right? And yet he kept getting elected to public office over and over again for 40 years. One has to ask oneself why that was, and that's part of the story that I address in my book. So Richard openly lives with Julia. He openly, he openly raises Imogene and Adeline as his daughters. Everyone locally and nationally knows about this. They are not hidden. It is not like Jefferson and Hemings, where Jefferson never acknowledges Sally as his partner, never openly acknowledges their children together as his own, offspring. And this is only that the children only sort of are, sort of freed, sort of surreptitiously or through his will. This is something that is very open and is sort of and acknowledged. And not that everyone's necessarily happy about it, but this is something that Johnson is very, and in fact, part of the problem is that he's so open about it. There are newspaper articles and letters and editorials where people say, right, the problem is not that Richard Johnson is having interracial sex or is an amalgamationist, which is the term of the day, as opposed to miscegenation. The problem is that he's just so bold and open about it. If he could just have had more discretion, if he could have just been more discreet about it, then nobody would have cared, right? Henry Clay. Let's take Henry Clay, who is from the same state of Kentucky, who is a contemporary chronologically of Richard Johnson. They come up together politically and serve together at the same time. Henry Clay is married to a white woman and is a slaveholder, lives very close to Johnson, actually. And Henry Clay has a relationship with an enslaved woman. And his wife catches him down in the slave quarters having sex with this enslaved woman, who, by the way, he has a number of children with. And all hell, quite frankly, breaks loose on the Clay plantation when Henry's wife catches him in the act. And she of course throws a fit, and understandably so. So in order to keep the peace on the plantation and in his marriage, Henry Clay sells the Black woman and their children downriver to New Orleans to get rid of the evidence and keep the peace with his wife and save his marriage. So this is, and nobody says boo about it. Clay maintains his reputation, he maintains his political career and his marriage. And this reputation of being this like amazing, Christian abolitionist, etc. It's appalling, right? Johnson, on the other hand, has this sort of really unseemly reputation in a lot of quarters, even though he doesn't have a white, he doesn't have a white wife and he's not committing adultery. But he would have actually been better off among a lot of people had he had a white wife and been having sex with Julia on the sly and just covered it up. People were like, if he had just been discreet about it, it would have been fine, because that's what all these white men were doing. But Richard actually wrote a letter to a contemporary where he said, I married my wife in the eyes of God, and he's just fine with it. And he said, Jefferson is doing this, Poindexter is doing this, Clay is doing this. Nobody cares. But I married my wife in the eyes of God, and he's fine with it, and I'm fine with it, and they're all just going to have to put up with it, basically. So this is really why I decided to, call her his wife, because number one, she functions as his wife. Wife is not just about a piece of paper. It is a role with a whole series of responsibilities. Like I said earlier, she is functioning as his wife. He's gone for 6 months every year in DC, and she carries the keys to the plantation, oversees the enslaved labor force, has access to his lines of credit and his cash, is negotiating all the contracts. She's doing all of the work of a wife. She's bearing his children like a wife, running his slave labor force like a wife, taking care of all the work on the plantation like a wife. Everybody in the area treats her like his wife, right? They refer to her as the mistress of the plantation. And that's what mistress didn't mean sexual mistress. It meant mistress, just like master and mistress today. Those are the words that led to us saying, now using the words Mr. and Mrs. She was, for all intents and purposes, the wife. He had no white wife. She was his only wife. She was mother of his children. When they threw huge parties on the plantation where presidents and foreign dignitaries like the Marquis de Lafayette, came to visit, she was the one who organized those parties. She was the one who hosted those functions. Her daughters played the piano for the Marquis when he came to visit. She was the hostess. She did all of this. She cooked, she served, she entertained. If he calls her his wife, if everyone treats her as his wife, then I believe we need to accord her the respect of calling her his wife. I'm certainly not going to refer to her as a concubine or a mistress. Those are incredibly disrespectful terms. And they are terms that are generally used in the 19th century, especially, that are used to refer to Black women, right? To enslaved women. And to me, even if she was legally enslaved, Richard really, for all intents and purposes, did not treat her as if she was enslaved. And so in form and function, she was his wife, and therefore I choose to accord her the respect of that term.
To sort of circle back to your earlier philosophy, it's not about feelings. It's about the reality of the situation.
Correct.
Before I move on to my next question, you brought up something that I made me want to ask you, sort of a technical question about the daughters of Julia and Richard. Are they like legally freed, or are they just sort of never? Is that never even brought up? Do we know?
That's such a great question. I searched for manumission papers for Julia and for Imogene and Adeline. I never found official manumission records for any of them. But there never seems to be sort of an issue. No one ever brings it up. It's almost as if they ignore it. And it's kind of complicated, right? Because it's possible that he did free them and we just don't have the papers or the records, because the Scott County Courthouse
Hmm.
That's where they live in Georgetown, in that area in Scott County, Great Crossing, in Scott County, Kentucky. The Scott County courthouse had 2 fires during that time period. And so it's absolutely possible that those records were destroyed in one of those fires. So maybe he did free Julia and we just don't know. But when Julia passes away, the Great Crossings Baptist Church notes her death and refers to her as the slave of Colonel Johnson. And so, right, the property of, slave of Colonel Johnson, which is why I don't believe she was ever manumitted for that reason. Now, when it comes to his 2 daughters, it's very likely he did manumit them, and we don't have the records because of those courthouse fires. They both marry, straight up church marry, white men. How on earth would they have actually legally married white men if they were still enslaved? Right? Julia and Richard lived together for the better part of a quarter century. As far as I know, they didn't have a go to church and get married, but there's oral testimony from their former enslaved laborers that a preacher came to Blue Spring Farm, their plantation, and performed a wedding ceremony for Julia and Richard. So they actually apparently stood up together in front of a preacher and had a wedding ceremony. Okay, but both of the daughters, Adeline and Imogene, both legally married white men in church. That caused all kinds of commotion, by the way, in the area. There were newspaper editors who were very, very upset about the fact that white men from the area, they were like, what decent, upstanding, respectable white man would allow himself to legally, to marry, and then they used all kinds of negative terminology to refer to these, to these women who were the daughters of Julia and Richard, because they were, right, people of color, they were women of color. But they may have been enslaved. They may not have been enslaved. I don't have manumission records. They might have been destroyed in these 2 fires in the courthouse. But they were never. They were educated. As soon as they married, as soon as they turned 18, as soon as they married, local white men from the area, they inherited. Well, their father was still living, but their father transferred to them hundreds of acres of prime real estate, dozens of enslaved laborers, and over the years, more land, more cash, more enslaved laborers. They were enormously wealthy. I mean, incredibly wealthy. And no one said anything about it. I mean, they were very, very well-to-do, very, very well-educated, enormously. They were church attendees. One of the daughters dies very young, after only having 1 child. And in fact, when I sort of time it out, it's very possible that she died in late childbirth with her 2nd child. I suspect that's what happened. But the older daughter, Imogene, lives a long, long life, lives well into the 1880s, continues to live right in, the area, has 6 children, lives to be, great grandmother, and goes to, goes to a local church, lives as a white woman according to the records. Her children are white, her grandchildren are white, and her obituary is like this glowing sort of, after all of these decades of being castigated for being this, woman of color, et cetera, her obituary is just like she was this pious, wonderful, upstanding member of the church. Everyone respected her. It's like all of this stuff from the antebellum period has been completely forgotten. And by the 1870s and 1880s, people just like treat her like every other upstanding, respectable, pious, God-fearing white woman.
Wow.
Like, like they've just kind of completely, it's not like she went to California and like, you know, sort of hid who she was. She continues to live in her hometown and has just completely like, but the records just, she just crossed the color line right in her own hometown.
Wow. That is fascinating. Well,
So I,
yeah.
but yes, I mean, she literally, I mean, Richard, whether or not he legally freed her is unclear, but everyone just sort of treats Adeline and Imogene as if they are free. Their husbands are certainly white men, and all of their children and grandchildren. Eventually, of course, the Civil War happens and everybody is free, but even prior to that, everyone just sort of treats them like they are. And they inherit all this property, and they are among the wealthiest propertied, slave-holding, land-owning, free people of color, even prior to the war.
Wow. It's, you know, it's just sort of this question of like, is it just easier for them to pretend that like nothing is wrong with this image, or or is it just sort of easier to like, or does Richard's influence just means that it's hard to like complain about it? I don't know. There's like lots of rabbit hole questions there, but thank you. That's incredibly interesting. Um, to continue the pattern, I suppose, of circling back to things you've mentioned earlier. You mentioned that Richard, some of his letters survived, and in those, that's how we learn that Julia and their daughters are all literate. Do any of those surviving letters sort of shed more light on or tell us anything more about either Julia and Richard's relationship or about Julia and their daughters as people?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that. The letters that give us the most information are the ones that Richard wrote to Thomas Henderson, who was headmaster of Choctaw Academy, the Native American boarding school that I referred to earlier. And there's, thankfully, Henderson held on to those letters, and thankfully his family held on to those letters, and we can now read those. And in them, there's a running sort of back and forth between Richard and Thomas about things that are happening at Blue Spring, because Thomas Henderson and Julia essentially functioned as a partnership or a team overseeing the farm while Richard lived in Washington for those 6 months every year. Julia was in charge of Blue Spring, but Thomas had to help her with a lot of the physical disciplinary aspects of overseeing the enslaved labor force. So, you know, on many plantations, this was what happened when you had an absentee plantation owner. His wife would have to take care of a lot of the day-to-day, you know, sort of, you know, overseeing of the plantation, but there would have to be a male overseer as well to sort of take care of physical discipline or punishment. And that's essentially what was happening on Blue Spring Farm, is that Julia would have to take care of a lot of the, you know, sort of day-to-day running of operations. Like I said, dealing with contractors and vendors, handing out money, paying people, making sure that people were fed and clothed and all of those sorts of things. But if enslaved laborers didn't listen to her, if there were disciplinary issues that she couldn't handle, Thomas Henderson was supposed to actually mete out the punishment. He was literally supposed to flog people. He was supposed to beat them. He was supposed to, you know, sell people if that didn't work, that sort of thing. And so this is what's happening in the letters. When you piece them together, Richard is writing to Thomas and saying, Julia wrote to me about enslaved laborers who are not listening to her, who are, you know, not obeying her, you know, her commands. I want you to talk to her. I want you to find out who's disobeying her, who's not listening to her. She's written me that she's frustrated. She's written to me that she's upset, right? I want you to like find out who's not working, and I want you to flog them. I want you to bring in the local corporals or sheriffs. If you won't beat them, and have them beat them. If that doesn't work, I want you to sell them to so-and-so's plantation. Like, so there's all of this back and forth going on between Henderson and Johnson about the disciplinary aspects, but the information is coming to Richard via Julia. So Julia and Richard are writing to each other on a regular basis, and she's keeping him informed about those aspects. She's also writing to him about their daughters, and he's saying, Julia wrote to me that you're doing a great job, you being Thomas, about tutoring our daughters, educating our daughters, because how their daughters are getting educated is also from Thomas Henderson. Henderson is not only headmaster of Choctaw Academy. In the evenings, he goes up to the big house and he privately tutors Imogene, Adeline, and the women on the domestic house staff, the other enslaved women who labor in the house for the Johnson family. That's part of his agreement with the Johnsons, is that, you know, part of his job is he gets paid X number of dollars a year to be headmaster of the academy. But in addition to that, he also gets a house. He gets free room and board on Blue Spring Farm. So Henderson is married and he has children. So his wife and his children live at Blue Spring in a separate house. They get room and board. And Johnson's like, look, I'm gonna negotiate a good salary for you, but you know, you have to do me a solid on the side, basically. You have to, in the evenings, you have to come up and you have to like tutor my daughters and the house staff, right? Well, the house staff are not just any old people. They are Julia's relatives. They are her nieces and nephews. She has handpicked the house staff because her brother Daniel and Daniel's wife Patience are on the house staff, and Daniel and Patience's daughters are part of the house staff. So the house staff are Julia's kinfolk. So what Richard is doing is he's using Thomas to privately tutor his own daughters and Julia's kinfolk in the evenings to get them, a very good education. Because Thomas Henderson is a very, very, very talented man. He is a Baptist minister as well as a teacher. And so he actually is a rotating minister at Great Crossings Baptist Church, which is 2 miles down the road. And that's the church that the Johnson family attends. That's where Julia will be baptized. That's where Richard that's where the whole family goes to church, right? And that's where so it's a very closed circle in many ways, right? The family goes to Great Crossings. That's how Richard knows Thomas. That's how he gets Thomas to become headmaster of the academy. The academy's on the premises of the farm. That's how Thomas will get his job. That's where he and his family will live. Thomas will also tutor the daughters and the house staff. So you kind of see how this is kind of this very almost incestuous closed circle kind of community that's set up: church, school, home. So the daughters get this wonderful education, but Thomas is he has eyes on him. Julia writes letters to Richard saying, here's what's happening with the enslaved laborers, but here's how Thomas is doing at his job. Here's how he's doing with our daughters and the house staff in terms of training them and educating them. And so if Thomas isn't doing a good job, Richard's going to find out about it. And so the letters to give us a lot of information on how Julia is doing, how the daughters are doing. And Richard tells us, hey, I heard from Julia that the girls are doing really well at school. Thank you so much for, keeping up your end of the bargain, and that they're doing really well with their lessons and that they're progressing really well. And he even tells us, I got a letter from Adeline. I heard from the girls. Their penmanship is doing really great. They're learning so much. I'm so proud of them. Thank you so much. You know, like, so we learn a lot about his relationship with Julia and the girls through these letters that are going back and forth between he and Thomas Henderson. So even though they're kind of, it's third hand, we do learn a lot. And he's clearly very proud of his daughters. He's devastated when Adeline passes away so young. He talks about how much he loved her, how bereft he is that she's passed away so young. She had become a second sort of, she had become really his second hand on the plantation after her mother had passed away and taken over many of Julia's responsibilities. And he really mentions that, like, you know, she had become a confidant to him. She had taken over so many of Julia's responsibilities. He doesn't know how he's going to function without her. He was so proud of her. She was so prudent and wise and intelligent and godly. And he really, really thought very highly of her. So, but he thought highly of Julia. You know, he trusted her with his money. He trusted her to oversee contracts. And he talks about that. He's like, really, I trust Julia to handle everything. You know, he talks about that. And so he has great respect for Julia. He has great respect and admiration for Adeline. And these are Black women he's talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's amazing what you can piece out from these letters. You know, and it just makes me wish that we had their letters, that we had these women's letters. And it's just devastating to think that they were destroyed and that they don't exist, you know.
Hearing you talk about that, you know, it really strikes me because, like, especially about Adeline, you know, when looking into Van Buren, for example, you know, in comparison to Johnson and Julia, there's mountains of information, but there's nothing that's that emotional. And it's so interesting that Johnson is so open about things like that. And it makes you wish that you had more, like you said, because if he's that open, you know, what more could you learn? It's fascinating. And I guess on the note of Johnson, you've sort of referenced it multiple times here, but he has what I will describe as something like a two-faced reputation, in that some people absolutely seem to despise him, and yet he keeps getting reelected over and over, as you said. So I guess how does he do that, and where does this come from?
He's really beloved in the local community in Scott County because he's seen very much as a hero of the poor and the working classes and the downtrodden. He's the man who sticks up for the little guy. I mean, we have to understand first and foremost, right, that first of all, he comes from a very powerful, wealthy, elite family. So there's that. Second of all, he's a revolutionary. He's a war hero from the War of 1812. That doesn't hurt. And he's gravely injured, almost dies during the War of 1812. And he kind of, you know, he sort of makes a name for himself as having supposedly killed Tecumseh in battle. That's highly debatable, but you know, that sort of, you know, he was very, very gravely injured, did almost die, and he carried the wounds and the scars to his grave, certainly. So, you know, he was shot 5 times. His horse was shot out from under him. He went back to Congress really before he should have. Still very, very, you know, sort of crippled and injured. And so, but he always sticks up for the little guy. He talks, you know, he has legislation passed for pensions for people who fought in the war. He also has legislation passed saying that we have to continue the Sunday mail service. So he's seen as someone who is very much in favor of separation of church and state, for example. He's also someone who regularly opens up his home for celebrations that invite the entire township and the entire county and community. So when large dignitaries come to visit, like Monroe or the Marquis de Lafayette, it's not just for the elite or the one percenters, but he opens up Blue Spring Farm for the entire community. Even for 4th of July celebrations that are held at his home, it's for the entire community. And so literally, people from the smallest shoemaker or carpenter to the largest dignitary are welcome at Blue Spring Farm. And we have books, and pamphlets that have been written by people like Ebenezer Stedman, a shoemaker, who have written their accounts about going to Blue Spring Farm and how everyone was welcome. It didn't matter who you were and what your station was in life, that everyone was welcome at Blue Spring Farm. And so this is the thing, Richard Johnson is beloved by the common man. And those are the people who keep reelecting him to office year after year after year. But he also has this problem that there are a lot of people who find his personal life to be incredibly distasteful. Not because he's having sex with a Black woman, but not discreet about it. Because Jefferson and Clay and Poindexter and others are also having sex with Black women. They just are lying about it, right? They hide it. They're discreet about it. The problem is not interracial sex. The problem is lack of discretion. But Johnson is just so flagrant, right? He is open about it, and he's not just open about it. He wants people to accept Julia. He wants people to accept his daughters. He has Imogene and Adeline out in public, in open, playing the piano for the Marquis. He has Julia overseeing these soirees and public functions. What's more than that, he takes his family to church with him, right? There are seats set aside on the floor at the back, but on the floor at the back for his family at Great Crossing. And he actually has the nerve to take Adeline with him to a 4th of July celebration that the town holds. Now, this is where things become very complicated. People are willing to come to Great Crossing when the Johnsons throw a party. Everyone wants to eat his food and drink his wine. But they're not comfortable when he takes his family to public functions off of his own property and wants the townspeople to accept Julia and his daughters outside of, the church makes exceptions for them, right? That's when it becomes complicated. When Julia rides around town in a carriage, when he takes Adeline to this 4th of July celebration and he takes her to the tent where all the women are sitting. This is when there's pushback, because this is when the town says, no, you see, where white women have these positions of privilege, we cannot allow you to enter. This is, where I was talking before about the fact that where are the lines drawn? Mm-hmm. Where do Black women like Julia and her daughters have power and privilege, just like with the work I did in Charleston? Where are the lines drawn for these women in these families? Even with men who have so much power and privilege, like, Richard Johnson, where are the lines drawn? Where can they not go? Where can they, and this is what I found in researching, not only in Charleston, but with this book in particular, that even with all of his influence and power, Julia and her daughters find that when they attempt to go into spaces that are believed to be reserved for white women alone, that's when people begin to push back and say, here, but not here. This is where the line is drawn. Carriages are supposed to be reserved for white women alone. That's a level of respectability that we can't accord to you because you are still Black and you are enslaved. when Julia dies, she's not buried in the Great Crossings church graveyard because that's reserved for white people alone. That we might have accorded you some seats on the floor at the back, but we can't bury you in the church graveyard. So there's this constant tug of war, this constant negotiation, this constant push and pull over how far the privileges can go, even when you have a man with so much power as Richard Johnson. And when, yes, he's a congressman, yes, he's a senator, but when he runs for the vice presidency, this is when the schism appears in his own party. The Democrats are torn apart because within his own party, there are people who do not want him to run as Martin Van Buren's, VP, as his number two, because they say that's too close to the White House. If Van Buren were to die, Johnson would ascend to the White House. And do you want a, quote, amalgamationist as your president? Because that would bring Blackness into the White House. That would bring, biracial children and mixed race grandchildren into the White House. We can't have Blackness that close to the highest office in the land. And it literally divided the Democratic Party, and it blew it up from the inside, because when he ran on, tried to get the nomination for the vice presidency, it blew up the party from the inside out. And so it's a really, it shows you how divided the party and the nation was. And it's a division that we're really still dealing with today, as far as I'm concerned. These issues about interracial sex, about amalgamation, if you want, about biraciality, multiraciality. These are things that we still, haven't really fully dealt with. It goes back to our inability to want to fully face our history of slavery, our history of interracial sex, our history of interracial families. It really was. Richard's, public relationship was something that people did not want to deal with. It was okay while it was, gossip, it was pillow talk. He was a congressman, he was a senator, but once he wanted to run on the ticket, Martin Van Buren wasn't even comfortable with it. He went to Andrew Jackson and said, "Do I have to do this? I don't want to do this." And Andrew Jackson said, "He's my guy." And that is the only reason it went forward. But Richard Johnson was the only vice president in our entire history where his, he had to actually have his vice presidency confirmed in the House, in the House and in the Senate, because the Electoral College, it didn't clear the Electoral College because the electors of Virginia refused to cast their ballots for him. Why? Because of Julia.
Do you think it's fair to say that Richard Mentor Johnson may be one of, if not the most controversial vice presidential picks in U.S. history?
Well, I think yes. I mean, really, I do. Some people would say that Kamala Harris might have been controversial for some people, right? She's our first, African American and Asian, South Asian, right? And first female, right? Vice president. But that didn't have to go through what Johnson went through, what I just finished saying, which is that, we still, that her nomination still cleared the Electoral College. But I certainly think that this is why I think that Julia's story is so important right now in this particular moment. I think her story has always been important. Let me just rephrase that. But I think it's so important that her story is published now, now more than ever, because I believe that her story was erased from the larger textbooks because people were embarrassed about her and Richard Johnson's relationship. I think that Richard Johnson's white family was embarrassed that their brother didn't have a traditional wife or a traditional life. I think that Julia's descendants crossed the color line and hid the truth of their ancestry because in Jim Crow America, this was a dangerous story. And it was only very recently in the 1990s that many of the descendants began to uncover the truth of their heritage and literally discovered that they were descended from a vice president and his Black wife.
Wow.
And it was just shocking to them because, and in this country, you always, I mean, people are constantly going on about how they're descended from generals, presidents, and vice presidents. So, if he had had a white wife and a traditional life, they would have never hidden this, right? But the fact that it was slavery, that it was Blackness, that it was, out of wedlock, all of these things, I think that it was very sort of like hush hush. And so the people just didn't, it was hidden for, a century. But I think that, yes, I think that in this moment, we need to really, really talk about Julia. We need to talk about her, about Richard. We need to talk about the importance of this relationship in this moment as we talk about Black Lives Matter, and talk about why we are still hiding these relationships. She was not the only person who had this kind of a relationship. They were not the only couple that had this kind of relationship. Stories like this have been happened throughout the 250 years that America had, chattel slavery. But these relationships were hidden and erased and lost in so many ways because white people thought they were an embarrassment, and we need to bring them to the surface because women like Julia, their lives, women like Adeline and Imogene, right, their lives and stories matter, especially now in this moment. Black lives, right, have always mattered, but we need to talk about them, right? Kamala Harris has just been, right, sworn in as our 49th vice president. Richard was our 9th vice president. To me, I think that, the timing is absolutely crucial as we think about race, as we think about gender, as we think about slavery, as we think about Blackness, as we think about womanhood, right? The stories that were erased, the ones that were not, whose stories get told. I think it's absolutely crucial. And to me, the connections are really really rather amazing. The work that Julia did so that her daughters and her grandchildren could be free is really just absolutely striking to me. I don't believe that we could have a Kamala Harris if we didn't have the work of women like Julia. And so I think it's really critical that Julia's story be told and that her legacy be honored.
That's a lot, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I will speak for both myself and for the park when we say that we're very grateful that you are doing this research and that you are bringing Julia's story to light. We're all very much looking forward to your book when it does come out. The thing about telling history is that there's always more to tell, right? And there's always more to be found. And with this work and research you've been doing on Julia, and sort of by necessity as a result Johnson as well, you've really helped us bring out a story that we want to be telling as well. So we're very grateful for that. Thank you.
Really, it's my pleasure, and I'm excited to see this book finally come to fruition and tell both of their stories, but really tell Julia's story and the story of Imogene and Adeline as well, and just have more people understand just really the complicated nature of Black women's lives, in the antebellum era, and just the range of enslaved women's lives, because there was no, one story, that there were multiple stories, and enslaved women's lives didn't all look the same. They were, complicated. Like I said, there was a range. And, but I know that there was to me, there were so many other women who had lives that looked like Julia's, but we don't know about them because they weren't married to a vice president.
Right.
And so my hope is that if we can get Julia's story out there, it teaches us a little bit more about the complicated and diverse nature of enslaved women's lives. But it's really been my pleasure. Thank you for speaking with me.
No, thank you.